Loneliness is a language spoken by the wind, but sometimes, in the deepest silence, two souls can understand it without a single word. The year was 1878, and the wind across the vast Montana territory was a lonely voice. For 17-year-old Leona, it was the only constant companion she had known for 3 long years. Her cabin, a stubborn knot of timber against an endless sea of prairie grass, was an inheritance of silence and sorrow. Disease had claimed her mother, and a bottomless grief had taken her father soon after, leaving Leona in a world that had lost its color and its sound. She had retreated into herself, building walls of quiet to protect a heart that felt too fragile for the world's harsh noises. Her existence became a simple, repeating rhythm of survival, a life measured not in days but in sunrises and the turning of the seasons. Each dawn brought the same chilling routine. Leona would break the layer of ice in the water barrel, her breath a white cloud in the biting air. She moved with a quiet efficiency born of necessity, her small frame wrapped in her father's oversized, patched coat. The few snares she set for rabbits were often empty, a familiar, hollow ache echoing in her stomach. The landscape was her silent confidant. She knew the way the morning light painted the distant mountains in hues of pale rose and gold, and she could smell the coming rain on the wind long before the sky darkened. This land did not ask for words she could not offer. It simply was, immense and indifferent, a grand, lonely canvas upon which her small life was a single, silent brushstroke. Her world was one of textures and muted sounds. The rough bark of firewood, the dusty scent of the dry earth, the distant cry of a hawk. The silence within her was profound, a locked room where her own voice had been put away with the memory of her mother's lullabies. She did not feel pity for her situation. Self-pity was a luxury she could not afford, an indulgence that would blunt the sharp edge needed for survival. She simply endured, a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence. Days were spent mending clothes until they were more stitch than fabric, or grinding the last of her meager corn supply into coarse meal. It was a life stripped to its most essential elements, a testament to the raw, unyielding will to see another sunrise. She was a creature of the wild as much as the deer or the coyote, her senses honed to the subtle shifts in the environment. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached straw, was often whipped across a face that seemed permanently etched with a quiet watchfulness. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a depth that belied her years, as if they were still witnessing a tragedy she could never unsee. She was a part of this unforgiving land, shaped by its harsh winters and blistering summers. The solitude had become a part of her very being, a heavy blanket that was both a comfort and a burden. She knew nothing else, and in a way, she asked for nothing more than the quiet continuation of her isolated world. A persistent, gnawing hunger drove Leona farther than she typically dared to venture. The rabbits had grown scarce, their tracks absent from the usual places, and the ache in her belly was a constant, demanding companion. She followed a rocky draw that cut through the prairie, her boots crunching on the loose stones, the wind tearing at her thin dress. She moved with a practiced stillness, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of life. Reaching the last of her snares, she found it empty, the wire loop hanging uselessly. A wave of cold despair, sharp and familiar, washed over her. It was in that moment of bitter defeat, as she knelt to reset the trap, that she heard it, a sound that sliced through the moan of the wind. It was not an animal cry. It was a low groan of pure human agony, a sound that seemed to vibrate from the very earth beneath her. Fear, sudden and electric, shot through her. Her first instinct was to run, to flee back to the known safety of her cabin, a tiny sanctuary in a vast and dangerous world. The stories her father had told her, cautionary tales of desperate men in violent encounters, flooded her mind. But something held her fast. The sound was one of utter torment, a raw expression of suffering that transcended language. It spoke directly to the bruised, tender part of her heart that still remembered what it was to feel for another, a part of her she thought had long gone silent. Slowly, cautiously, she rose to her feet, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the backdrop of the whispering wind. She crept through a thicket of gnarled sagebrush, her every sense on high alert. And then she saw him. He was lying at the base of a large rock outcropping, partially hidden in the afternoon shadows. He was a Lakota man, his heritage clear in the proud lines of his face and the intricate beadwork on his leather leggings. But the fine clothing was ruined, stained dark with his own blood. A deep, ragged wound marked his side, and another marred his shoulder. His face, a mask of strength and authority, was now pale and tight with pain. A magnificent pinto horse with intelligent, watchful eyes stood nearby, its reins trailing on the ground. It nudged its master's still hand, a silent plea for him to rise. The ingrained fear of her time, the whispered warnings from the settlement of Solitude Creek about savages and brutal raids, screamed at her to turn back. He was the other, the danger she had been taught to avoid at all costs. But then another groan tore from his lips, and his body shuddered. His eyes flickered open and met hers. In their dark depths, Leona did not see a monster. She saw a man, wounded and dying, a man as utterly alone in his pain as she was in her silence. An intense war raged within Leona. The cautious survivor, the part of her that had endured through isolation, urged her to leave him to his fate. It was not her struggle. Helping him could bring untold trouble to her door. Yet, the part of her that remembered her mother's gentle touch, the part that knew the bitter sting of abandonment, could not turn away. To leave him here would be to embrace the very cruelty that had shattered her own world, to let the silence and the emptiness win completely. Her decision was not a conscious thought, but a physical impulse. She took a deep breath of the cold, clean air and stepped out from behind the sagebrush into the open. The pinto horse tossed its head and shied away, its nostrils flaring. But the man's eyes remained fixed on her. She approached slowly, her hands held open and empty, a universal sign that she meant no harm. Kneeling beside him, she saw the severity of his injuries up close. They were clearly from a firearm. His skin was hot to the touch. A dangerous fever was already taking hold. He would not survive the coming night out here, not with the promise of an early snow sharp in the air. A profound sense of responsibility settled over her, heavy and undeniable. She had to try. He was a man of solid build, and she was wiry and small. The task of getting him to her cabin seemed impossible, but desperation lent her a strength she did not know she possessed. She spoke to him in a low, soothing tone, though she knew he would not understand the words. "I will help you. Please, you must try to stand." He watched her, his gaze clouded with pain, but holding a flicker of understanding. With monumental effort, she managed to get him to lean on her, his arm draped over her shoulders. His weight was a staggering burden, threatening to crush her with every step. With the horse following placidly behind them, she began the slow, agonizing journey back to her home. The world narrowed to the few feet of ground in front of her, the sinking sun, and the wounded man who was now her charge. Each step was a monumental effort. His groans of pain mixed with her own ragged breaths, a grim chorus against the sighing of the wind. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Just as she felt her legs would give out, the dark shape of her cabin appeared against the darkening plains. By the time she half dragged, half carried him through the door, the first delicate snowflakes had begun to drift from the bruised and darkening sky, silent messengers of the coming storm. The ordeal had just begun, but for now, they had reached a fragile sanctuary. The interior of the cabin, which had always felt vast and empty with her loneliness, was now shockingly small. The space was crowded with his presence, filled with the scent of leather, pine, and his fevered pain. He was a piece of the untamed land brought indoors, and he seemed to suck the very air from the small room. She eased him onto her own narrow cot, the only soft place in the entire structure. He collapsed onto the thin mattress with a shuddering sigh, his eyes closing in exhaustion. For a long moment, Leona stood frozen, the full weight of what she had done crashing down on her. She had brought a stranger, a wounded warrior, an unknown danger into the heart of her solitary world. The silence was different now. It was no longer the hollow silence of solitude, but the heavy, charged silence of two people in a confined space, separated by a gulf of culture, language, and fear. But there was no time for regret or second thoughts. His breathing was shallow, and she saw that the bleeding from his side had started afresh. Shaking off her fear, she moved with the practiced economy of someone long used to hardship. She stoked the fire in the small stone hearth until it blazed, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. She set a pot of water to boil, the hiss and bubble, a strangely comforting sound in the tense quiet. From a small wooden chest she took her mother's most precious possessions, clean linen rags, a needle and thread, and a small tin of herbal salve that smelled of yarrow and pine. These were the last tangible links to a life of care and affection. She gently cut away the blood-stiffened leather of his tunic, her movements careful and deliberate. The wounds were serious. One projectile had passed through his shoulder, but the other looked worse, lodged deep in his side. She knew nothing of removing bullets, but she knew about cleaning wounds and stopping the bleeding. With a basin of hot water and the clean rags, she began her work. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew steady and sure. He awoke during the process, his body tensing, his dark eyes flying open. They were sharp with pain and immediate suspicion, locking onto her with fierce intensity. He made a move to sit up, a hostile growl rumbling deep in his chest. Leona froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She held up her hands, showing him the clean cloth and the basin of water, her expression pleading. She had no words to explain her intentions, no way to tell him she was trying to help. She could only hope that her actions would speak for her, that he would see the truth in her eyes. He stared at her for a long, breathless moment. His gaze was intense and piercing, as if he could see right through her skin and into the silent, frightened chambers of her heart. He was assessing her, weighing her every subtle movement. He saw not a threat, but a slip of a girl with haunted eyes and hands that trembled slightly but did not stop their gentle work. He saw the genuine concern that softened her features. Slowly, with a visible effort of will that must have cost him dearly, he relaxed his body back onto the cot. He did not trust her, not yet, but he was granting her a fragile reprieve. He was choosing to believe in her compassion over his own fear. She worked for over an hour, cleaning the injuries as best she could. She made a poultice from the yarrow salve, a thick paste her mother had taught her to make from ground root and river clay, and packed it carefully into the wounds before binding them tightly with strips of linen. He bore the immense pain with a stoicism that stunned her. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white, where he gripped the edge of the cot, but not another sound escaped his lips. When she was finished, he was slick with sweat, his face pale under his dark skin, but his breathing seemed a little easier. Exhausted, Leona sat back on her heels, the small cabin seeming to spin around her. The snow was falling heavily now, a thick white curtain that sealed them off completely from the rest of the world. The wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the single glass pane in the window. He was shivering, a deep tremor that shook his entire body as the fever and the cold waged war on him. Leona looked at him, then at her own thin blanket folded at the foot of the cot. It was her only one, a patchwork of wool and flannel that had kept her from freezing on countless brutal winter nights. It was the barrier between her and the unforgiving cold of the plains. A single night without it could be deadly. Without a second thought, she picked it up. It smelled of wood smoke, and of her, the scent of her solitary life. She unfolded it and gently laid it over him, tucking it carefully around his broad shoulders. He opened his eyes again, his gaze following the movement. He looked at the heavy blanket, then at her. He saw her thin dress, saw her shiver as a draft snaked through a crack in the wall. He understood the sacrifice. It was a gift of immense value, an offering of warmth and life itself. For the first time, the suspicion in his eyes softened, replaced by something else, something deeper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a fragile bridge built across the silent chasm between them. For 2 full days and nights the snowstorm raged, cocooning the small cabin in a world of swirling white and wind. Inside, a strange, unspoken truce settled between its 2 inhabitants. Leona moved about her chores with a quiet grace, tending the fire, melting snow for water, and checking on her patient. He remained on the cot, mostly sleeping, his body locked in a fierce battle against the fever and the infection that threatened his life. When he was lucid, she would carefully spoon thin broth made from dried herbs and a precious bit of salt pork into his mouth. When the fever rose, she would bathe his face with cool water, her touch gentle and comforting. In those quiet, snowbound days, a silent rhythm developed between them. He would watch her through half-closed eyes, his expression unreadable. She learned that his name was Honovi, a Lakota warrior of some importance. He had been leading a hunting party when they were ambushed by whiskey traders whose poisoned goods he had forbidden from his people's territory. He had been left for dead and had ridden until his strength finally gave out in the rocky draw where she had found him. But in the cabin, he was not a great warrior. He was simply a man, stripped of his power and authority, utterly dependent on the kindness of a silent, solitary girl. Honovi watched her constantly. He saw the worn-out soles of her boots, the careful way she rationed their meager food supply, and the deep, abiding sadness that lived in her stormy eyes. He saw a strength in her, a quiet, enduring force like the prairie grass that bends in the wind but never breaks. He noted that she never spoke, not even to herself. He saw her flinch at any sudden loud noise, the way she would wrap her arms around herself as if to hold her own broken pieces together. He began to understand that her silence was not one of choice, but of deep, unhealed pain. On the third day, the storm subsided, and his fever finally broke. Honovi awoke to find the cabin filled with the pale, clean light of a sunlit snowfield. His head was clear for the first time in days. The pain in his side was a sharp, clean fire, instead of a dull, consuming blaze. Leona was sitting by the hearth, carefully mending a tear in her dress. She looked up and saw that he was awake and truly seeing her. She rose and brought him a cup of water. As he drank, his eyes met hers over the rim of the tin cup. He handed it back to her, and their fingers brushed for a fleeting moment. The brief contact was like a spark, a jolt of shared humanity. Their communication now became a silent language of gestures and expressions, a mutual respect growing in the space where words would have been. As Honovi slowly regained his strength, the dynamic between them began to shift. He was no longer just her patient. One afternoon, Leona struggled to haul a heavy log inside for the fire, her small frame straining under its weight. Before she could drop it, Honovi was there. He moved slowly, his face tight with the effort, but he took the other end of the log without a word. Together, they carried it inside and placed it by the hearth. It was a simple act, but it marked a profound change. They were now partners in the small, demanding enterprise of survival, a team forged in silence and shared hardship. Their quiet cohabitation had become a collaboration. He began to contribute in other small ways. He showed her how to better fletch an arrow for her small hunting bow, his hands, though still weak, moving with an innate skill. He took a piece of firewood and, with Leona's small utility knife, began to carve. For hours he would sit by the fire, the wood shavings falling around him, his concentration absolute and unwavering. He was carving an eagle, its head turned, its wings slightly spread as if about to take flight. The detail was exquisite, the creature imbued with a spirit of wild freedom and fierce independence. When he was finished, he held it out to her, a silent offering. Leona took the carved eagle, her fingers tracing the smooth, intricate lines. It was beautiful, a perfect representation of the proud birds she often saw soaring high above the plains. She looked at him, her eyes shining with an emotion she had not felt in years, a warmth that spread through her chest. It was the first gift she had received since her father was alive. Without thinking, she turned and walked to her small wooden chest. From beneath a pile of mended clothes, she took out a small, oval frame. It held a faded photograph of a smiling man and woman, their arms around each other. Her parents. She had never shown it to anyone. She held it out to him. Honovi took the photograph with a reverence that surprised her. He studied the faces of the man and woman, then looked at Leona, seeing the clear resemblance in the shape of her eyes and the set of her jaw. He saw her heritage, her loss. He handed it back gently, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. In that moment, they were not a settler's daughter and a Lakota warrior. They were two people who had known profound grief, two souls who had found a moment of quiet communion in a world that had tried to break them both. He had seen her past, and she had seen the artist in him. The walls between them had crumbled into dust. Gideon Rourke was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the Montana Territory itself. A trapper with a mean disposition and a proprietary view of the world, he considered any land he walked on to be his. He had known of the orphan girl in the old Miller cabin, viewing her with a mixture of pity and contempt. An unmarried woman living alone was an affront to the natural order of things in his mind. A fortnight after the storm, Rourke was checking his trap lines when he cut the tracks. They were faint in the melting snow but unmistakable, the tracks of a shod horse and beside them the distinct print of a Lakota moccasin. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. He followed them, his curiosity transforming into a dark certainty. The tracks led him into the very draw where Leona had found Honavi. He found the signs of a struggle, a patch of ground stained with dried blood. The trail then led directly toward Leona's cabin. He did not approach the cabin directly. Instead, he circled around, using the terrain for cover like a predator stalking its prey. Hidden in a stand of aspen trees, he raised his spyglass. He watched for a long time, his patience as vast as the plains. He saw the girl, Leona, throwing a bucket of dirty water out the door. That was normal. What was not normal was the fine pinto horse sheltered in the lean-to. As he watched, the cabin door opened again, and a man stepped out into the sun, stretching his arms. It was the Lakota warrior. He moved stiffly, like a man recovering from a serious injury, but he was undeniably there, at the girl's home. A dark, ugly poison filled Rourke's mind. He saw not a man recovering from injury, but a savage who had taken advantage of a helpless girl. He imagined the worst, his mind painting lurid pictures fueled by a lifetime of prejudice and fear. He lowered the spyglass, his face a mask of grim certainty. He knew what he had to do. He saw himself as a protector of civilization, a guardian against the wilderness and its perceived dangers. He rode hard for the settlement of Solitude Creek, his horse kicking up slush and mud. He burst into the saloon, the only real gathering place the town offered, and the low murmur of conversation ceased. All eyes turned to him. "There is a Lakota buck holed up at the Miller place," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "The orphan girl, she is with him. I saw it myself." A wave of unease and excitement rippled through the room. Men who spent their days in backbreaking labor or mind-numbing boredom were suddenly alive with a dark purpose. "He is a warrior," Rourke insisted. "Lord knows what he has done to her or what he plans for us." Rourke played on their deepest fears, fears of attack, fears for their women, fears of the vast, unknown land and the people who had been there first. He painted Leona not as a compassionate soul, but as a victim, a foolish girl whose actions now endangered them all. "We cannot just leave him there," one man shouted. "He will bring others," another added, his voice trembling, "a whole war party." The fear, fanned by Rourke's certainty, quickly turned to a righteous anger, the kind that feels like courage. They were not a mob, they were protectors. Within the hour, Gideon Rourke had gathered a posse of a dozen men, armed with old rifles and a shared, ugly sense of purpose. The sound of approaching horses reached Leona first. It was a rhythmic thudding that vibrated up from the frozen ground, an alien sound in her quiet world. She was outside, scattering the last of her chicken feed, when she heard it. Honavi, who was splitting kindling with slow, deliberate strokes, heard it too. He straightened up, his head cocked, his expression instantly hardening from one of peaceful focus to that of a wary warrior. He looked at Leona, and she saw in his eyes the same alarm that was clutching at her own heart. They saw them then, a dark line of riders cresting the nearest ridge, silhouetted against the blood orange of the sunset. They rode with grim intent, not with the leisurely pace of travelers. Leona's blood ran cold. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, who they were and why they were coming. Inside, Honovi's voice was a low rasp, one of the first words he had spoken in her presence. "Go," he said, pushing her toward the back of the cabin. But she would not move. He grabbed her arm, his strength having largely returned, and pulled her behind him as he barred the door. He moved to the single window, peering out through a crack in the shutter. The posse surrounded the small cabin, their faces hard and unyielding in the fading light. Gideon Rourke dismounted, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "Leona Miller," he yelled, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You in there? Come on out now. We know you are not alone." Leona shrank back, pressing herself against the cold wall. Honovi glanced at her, his face calm but his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. He picked up the iron poker from the hearth. It was a poor weapon against a dozen rifles, but he held it as if it were a warrior's lance. "We do not want to hurt you, girl," Rourke called out again, his voice taking on a wheedling, patronizing tone. "We are here to help you. Just send out the savage, and we will leave you be." The word savage struck Leona like a physical blow. They were talking about the man who had carved a beautiful eagle for her, the man who had shared his story of loss through a simple look, the man who had helped her carry firewood when he could barely stand. The fear that had held her captive for so long began to burn away, replaced by a hot, bright flame of anger. Honovi made a move toward the door, ready to face them, to die fighting if he must. But Leona put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She shook her head fiercely. This was her home. These men, in their ignorance, were the ones bringing violence. She would not hide behind him. She took a deep, shuddering breath, unbarred the door, and stepped outside. She stood on the small porch, a small, defiant figure in a worn dress, blinking in the twilight. She pulled the door closed behind her, shielding Honovi from their view. Rourke smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "That is a good girl. Now, just step aside and tell your friend to come out with his hands empty." Leona stood her ground. She looked at the faces of the men she had seen in Solitude Creek, men who had ignored her or looked through her. Now they all stared at her, their eyes filled with suspicion and menace. She shook her head, a single, sharp motion. Rourke's smile vanished. "Last chance," he growled, raising his rifle. The other men followed suit, the sound of a dozen rifles being cocked echoing in the tense silence. It was in that moment that a new sound began, a sound so deep and pervasive it seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of 1,000 hoofbeats, a soft, drumming thunder that grew steadily louder. Every man in the posse turned, their faces turning slack with disbelief and then stark terror. Over the ridge where they had come, and the next, figures appeared. Warriors on horseback, their forms dark against the last light of day. There were hundreds of them, their number swelling until it seemed the very hills had given birth to a silent, implacable army. The door opened behind Leona. Honovi stepped out beside her. He stood tall, a chief among his people. He raised a hand, and on the ridge, a lone warrior raised a lance in reply. Gideon Rourke stared, his mouth agape, his courage evaporating into cold dread. He and his men were insignificant gnats threatening a great eagle. Without a word, he mounted his horse and fled. The rest of the posse scrambled to follow. In the quiet that followed, a warrior brought Honovi a fresh horse. He turned to Leona, his eyes filled with a gratitude that needed no words. He left a large bundle of furs and provisions at her feet, then led his people west. Leona stood alone again, but wrapped in the warmth of a gifted buffalo robe, she knew the silence was now one of peace.